Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Standing in the Dark, a weekly podcast interviewing stage managers on and off Broadway and regional theater. We are here with Michael J. Passaro, the current production stage manager of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and my advisor and head of the program at Columbia University Stage Management Department. Good morning, Michael.
Hi, Rachel. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing this fine morning?
I am great. It's a beautiful day here in New York, and two-show day at Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, so everything is right with the world.
Mm-hmm. And this is your first two-show day?
This is our first Wednesday. Two-show day. It's our first 8-show week. We're in our third full week of previews. Next week is our last week of previews and critics' performances, so we're nearly over the finish line for this part of the process. But as you know, once the show opens, you're in a whole new phase, a new chapter with training understudies, getting into the rhythm of a regular 8-show a week run. But all is good so far.
All right. Well, we'll get to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory a little bit later. Michael, how did you get into theater and to stage management?
Well, it's very interesting that we are sitting backstage at the Newman Theater here at the Public Theater complex in Lower Manhattan, because I became very interested in the theater when I happened to stumble upon my mother watching the Tony Awards one night in our family room. And it was 1975, and it was the year that Chorus Line was up for all of the Tony Awards, and the opening number for the Tony Awards that year was the opening number for Chorus Line, I Hope I Get It. So I think it's just great symmetry that you and I are having this conversation backstage at the Newman Theater, where A Chorus Line actually began its incredible life back in the mid-'70s, and we're talking about how I got into the theater today. When I saw that Tony Awards broadcast and I saw that opening number, I had no idea what a Broadway musical was, what Broadway was, and even being born in New York City and raised only 2.5 hours upstate, I had no idea what any of this was about, but I was immediately captivated, and I said to my mother, I said, "What's that? Where can we see that? What's that about?" And she explained to me about Broadway musicals in New York and the theater and all. And a year later, I went as part of my birthday in the summer to see Chorus Line at the Shubert Theater uptown. And it just began a lifelong interest in the theater, and I became more interested in learning more about it and being involved, and got involved in high school and college and in graduate school, and began my career working as a stage manager right after I began graduate school at NYU in the mid-'80s. And I had initially not been completely interested in stage managing. I kind of had an idea as to what stage managers did, but like many of us, and many of your colleagues and student colleagues, and many of the students I interview for Columbia, sort of fell into it. I began working as a production intern at one of the most respected and venerable general management firms at the time, Gatchell and Neufeld, which is no longer in existence. But at the time, Gatchell and Neufeld, Tyler Gatchell and Peter Neufeld, were in charge of some of the most successful Broadway shows at the time, including Cats, Annie, Crazy for You, many, many, many other Broadway shows. And I worked there as an intern. And at the end of my semester there, I was very interested in becoming a company manager. And there was a position that opened up in the office as one of the office associates. And I thought, well, this is perfect. I am here as an intern. Someone is leaving. I'm going to just step right into that job. I mean, it could not be more perfect. So I went to Peter Neufeld and I said, I want to be considered for that job. I'm here. I mean, this is a no-brainer. Just hire me. And he said, I don't think you're ready for it. He said, I think if you want to be a company manager, you should learn how these Broadway shows are put together. You should get in the trenches, see how the productions are made, see all the pieces and parts and how they fit together. And he said, I would suggest that you apply to be a production assistant on a new musical they were doing that spring that they were managing called Starlight Express, which, if you know anything about Starlight Express, was originally produced in London, written by Andrew Lloyd Webber. It was sort of the, what I call the companion piece to Cats, in that all of the actors were portraying various types of trains and railway cars, and they were all on roller skates. That was sort of the big gimmick. Anyway, I was devastated that I wasn't hired as a company management associate at Gatchel and Neufeld, so I begrudgingly accepted Peter's invitation to interview for Starlight Express with the stage managers, and I was hired as a production assistant. I showed up for rehearsal every day. I mopped the floors. I helped them set up for the daily rehearsals, and I was also in charge of helping all of the actors with their roller skates, tightening up the wheels, making sure they were working all right. And the stage managers on that show, Frank Hartenstein, who was the production stage manager, Perry Klein, who was the first assistant, and Randy Whitescarver, now known as C. Randall White, were the stage managers, and they took me under their wing. And when we moved to the theater, they said, we need another stage manager, another assistant stage manager. The show is very technically complicated, and we would like you to come on board. I mean, I had no idea what a Broadway stage manager really did, but when you're 23 years old and someone dangles an equity contract in front of you, I mean, the ASM salary at that point, I think, was $775 a week, which is still a lot of money. But in 1987 was, that much more money. And I said, sure, why not? Just like any 23-year-old would do. I can jump in not knowing anything about what I'm about to do or about to get into, and I'll be fine. And I was, and I loved it, and here I am. Almost 30 years later, so.
How many shows have you done since then?
Well, I think that Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is my 30th or 31st Broadway show. I can't remember, and I'm not being coy about that. I've done a lot. I've been lucky, and I've been really blessed to be able to work in this business at the highest levels in terms of the commercial theater, in terms of production values, in terms of contract rates, in terms of the colleagues that I've been able to work with over the years, and it's been a great journey. I mean, it's been, as many people know, and this is something that Peter Neufeld taught me when I was an intern in his office so many years ago, that the theater is an incredibly competitive and heartbreaking business. And stage managers need to have not only a very good facility with numbers and organization and record keeping and things like that, but they also have to have a great sense that it's a business that makes great demands on the soul. And that's something that I've carried with me all these years. And I think it's something that I also try to pass on to my students. It's a quote that I've, I'm sure, Rachel, you've heard me say a number of times. Mm-hmm. And it's something that's guided me, I think, almost every day that I've worked. And it's been able to sort of help me see the forest for the trees, keep things in perspective, and understand that everybody who gets to, who's lucky enough to work on Broadway, has had a journey of some sort, and the reasons that they're there and the reasons that they want to be there, and how they're able to sort of manage that experience is all related to that.
What's something else you wish you knew before you got thrown into this 30-something years ago?
Well, it's, it's probably a lesson that comes only with time and hindsight and 2020 vision and being able to look back over the years. But it's also that not only what I said before, that it's the demands that the business makes on the soul, but it's also the time that it takes from your personal life. And it's something that I've been able to manage fairly well, but it's also something that you can't really explain until you're in the middle of it or on the other side of it, that it does take a lot of time away from personal endeavors. And there's we talk a lot about this in class, the work-life balance, and I think that your generation has a much better sense of and sensibility as to how to try to manage that in a very holistic way. And I wish that we had that kind of training, or at least someone talking about that when I was much younger. I had to sort of figure it out on my own. I'm not sure I have still figured it out, in fact.
What do you do now to try to keep your work-life balance in check?
Well, as we talk about in class, we talk a lot about the Myers-Briggs, introvert versus extrovert. And the introvert definition, as far as Myers-Briggs is concerned, is someone who needs to gather his or her energy by themselves, quietly, privately. It's not about being shy or outgoing. So I try to spend as much time as I can, and whether it's an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening, just being by myself, so I can focus or de-stress at the end of the day, whatever the case might be. And you have to carve out, I think you have to carve out those moments for yourself, whatever it is, whether it's, you go to the gym, whether you read a book, you do whatever it is, I think you need to. Or if you're an extrovert and want to be in more energetic situations, perhaps you spend your time around a lot of other people. But as an introvert, that's how I choose to sort of spend my time and re-energize. Even though on the Myers-Briggs scale, I'm clearly, firmly in the introvert category in terms of how they, score things. I say often that 99% of my job is spent being an extrovert. So it's not that I can't do it, but it takes a lot of energy to do that. It's not my natural first choice of how to be in the workplace, but you have to be. As a stage manager, you have to be.
Discussing all of the shows that you've done, what do you think your best show, the most fun you've had over the years? You can have several. You don't just have to have one.
Yeah, I'm often asked that question, and it always usually relates to the experience of putting the show together, not necessarily the material or the acclaim that any one of these shows may or may not have received. There are 4 that come to mind, all of which received a certain amount of acclaim in their own right, but some of which are not, generally talked about today. One of the greatest experiences I had was as an assistant stage manager early in my career, was on a show called The Will Rogers Follies, and that is mostly because of the experience that we had working with that particular group of people. It was the last show that very famous musical comedy authors Betty Comden and Adolph Green, it was their last original show that they wrote for Broadway back in the early 90s. It was also a show in which I have forged lifelong friendships, and we had just the best time. It didn't get the best reviews. It had a successful run, I think 3 years on Broadway, although I didn't stay for the entire run. I went out on the road company for it. But it remains to this day one of the greatest, most fun experiences I had. There was just something about the energy of that particular group of people that even today, I think of certain stories and they just bring a huge smile to my face. And I listen to, once in a while on my iPod or music, whatever they call it these days, on the shuffle command, once in a while, the opening number for Will Rogers' Follies will come up, Will Amania, and I swear I can still call the cues. I still hear those cues and what they did in my head. It was a great experience. Right after that, I was lucky enough, this whole one of the great things about what you're doing here, Rachel, is this idea of legacy and how we are all connected, and the history of those who came in the generations before us in terms of modern stage managing, those of us who are practicing it now, and those who will carry on these methodologies, traditions, and histories into the future is so incredibly important to me. So, for example, the first show I did, Starlight Express, I was lucky enough to work with a mentor of mine, Perry Klein, who then hired me in variously in the intervening years, but he was then asked to be the production stage manager on a play called Angels in America, which had been produced originally, I think, at the Mark Taper Forum in the early 90s, and then came to Broadway in a completely revamped production, directed by, again, talking about history, legacies, directed by George Wolfe, who was for many, many years the artistic director here of the Public Theater, designed by Robin Wagner, who designed A Chorus Line. So these things, I literally get goosebumps when I think about these things, that we're sitting in this building talking about these things.
Didn't Oscar Eustis commission that?
Yes, and
Okay.
I have to say I'm not. I'm only peripherally aware, and I know he was. I'm not peripherally aware. I know that he was. I know that Oscar was unbelievably instrumental in actually getting that play to be heard, read by actors around a table, whatever, the very first time. So he is absolutely, etched in stone in the legacy of that project. I don't know Oscar at all, but what he's done here in this building, as we talked about when we came in, is unbelievable. Anyway, I digress. Angels in America. Perry Klein, who I met on Starlight Express, the first Broadway show I did, asked me to be an assistant stage manager on Angels in America. It was the first play I'd ever done. Up to that point, I'd only done musicals. So working with the actors in that play, most of whom, I guess, had done the production out at the Mark Taper Forum, were a tight-knit group. Working with actors in a play can be a little bit different from working with actors, singers, and dancers in a musical. So it was terrifying for me, but I also knew that, I had to do it. I knew what the subject matter was. It was also at a time, there was the confluence of what that play was about and what was going on in the world at the time was unlike anything else I can remember in my personal and professional history. And that, again, has brings up incredible memories of that time, what we were going through as human beings here in New York City with the AIDS crisis, and it taught me lessons, not only on how to work not only work lessons, but life lessons that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. The acclaim that the play received, to me personally, is only part of the incredible fondness, isn't even the right word, the incredible profoundness of working on that play and being involved with that, and working with unbelievable artists like George Wolfe, Tony Kushner, Robin Wagner, the actors in that play, and knowing what an effect we were having on the audience is, again, something that I hope we talk about a lot in classes, how the audience is our the final piece of the puzzle as stage managers. And even though we are standing in the dark, as you say, backstage, they are our link to the outside world and what we're ultimately trying to put across the footlights. I worked on a revival of a musical called Carousel at Lincoln Center Theater, which was directed by Nicholas Heitner, and again was one of the most incredible experiences I've had. And I have a very grainy, this is back in 1993, 94. I have a very grainy videotape that someone brought in some massive videotape machine of one of the final previews of Carousel. And I sometimes, watch it, and it's still, even it's very grainy and the sound isn't great, but what the power of that music and that production still, give me goosebumps when I watch it. I worked on a play called The History Boys, also directed by Nicholas Heitner, which was an incredible experience for me. So everyone, those are just four, major highlights. But as I tell all of you, you have to find something in each one of these shows to love, and it could be the experience backstage, like Will Rogers Follies. It could be the link to the what's going on in the world and what you're producing as artists every night in Angels in America. It could be that incredible music and Carousel, whatever it is. You have to fall in love with something on all of these shows. It can, and believe me, it could be the paycheck. That's perfectly fine. But if you don't find, it could be somebody you work with. It could be moments that you have at the water cooler or at the coffee station with somebody in the cast that, fuel you through the experience. But so in that way, I always try to find something that I can take away, and bring to my next experience and grow it. It's what I call tilling the soil, making sure that whatever roots of something you find in one show that you can try to capitalize on in the next.
Let's take a 180. Let's talk about your most difficult experiences you've had so far.
Well, it's interesting because I have been lucky enough to sort of grow up in this business where I think there's been two major fundamental shifts. One is the development of what I call sort of the modern automation and motion control of scenery, lighting, sound, projections, video, whatever. When we started Starlight Express, as incredible as that design was, and in not only in the way it worked, but the scope of it, it was really like being in a frontier. It was like forging through new lands in terms of scenery and motion control. That has been developed very successfully throughout the years. But it was not easy at first, and it was not easy in the intervening years, when you wanted to try to do something, complicated. Even Angels in America, which, let's see, Starlight Express was 1987, Angels in America was 1992, so there's about 5 years there. The design for Angels in America was incredibly complicated, and it was, not easy as great as that experience was, it was not easy to get to 3.5 hour plays up and running on the same set with an enormous amount of automation. George staged it. Things swirled around on stage and came through panels, and the tracking system looked like a sunburst. So you had 6 or 7 tracks leading into spinning panels. So the panels would spin around, one piece would come out, it would track off, the panel would spin around, another piece would track on. So it was very, very hard to set up those things. The other major shift is sort of been in the business model of Broadway itself. It is still, I know you've heard me say this a million times, it is still at its root, very much a mom and pop business. But, with, in the period of 1986 to now, what's the major thing that's happened to our culture and life and what we rely on every day? The internet. The explosion of of how people can access Broadway has changed how we deliver these shows, because we're not just delivering them to an audience of 1,000 to 1,500 people a night who then go and talk about it amongst themselves. We're delivering it to a worldwide audience on a nightly basis. Even though you may not think that, we are able to be accessed 24/7. So that has changed how the shows are produced, how they're managed, how stage managers fit into that model. So instead of really focusing on like one particular show that might have been particularly difficult for whatever reason, the creative team wasn't in sync, the actors were difficult to work with, the set didn't work, whatever issues or whatever challenges I might have experienced in my career, I think are due to larger constructs. I just between Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is a great example of a creative team that has been on the same page, going toward the same goal since they began talking about this version of the show. We did 2 lab productions of it last spring, and then since that ended in July of last year, this team has been completely on the same page as to what they wanted to see on that stage at the L'Enfantine Theater this afternoon. So in that respect, that's been one of the greatest experiences in terms of a creative team really being in sync. Of course, there have been disagreements, but because the foundation of what they're trying to do is so cut from the same cloth, those disagreements can be sort of fairly easily resolved. There's never been a moment where anybody has said, "What are we doing here? What are we going for? I don't understand." There have been other experiences which have not been like that, where I'll never forget. Of course, I'm not going to say what show it was, but the director walked in to the theater on the first day of tech and said, "Oh my God, I had no idea it was going to look like that." So. Just a comment like that, indicates there was probably a great deal of dysfunction, and at that particular moment in time, when it's all eyes are on the stage managers, to try to make this stuff work, it becomes, a difficult challenge.
How did you handle that situation?
Well, I'm constantly, again, something else we talk about in class is that. You have to be reassessing every minute, every hour of the day. So in the moment, it's sometimes much more challenging to do. In hindsight, it's a little bit easier, but it's also I wish I had handled that situation differently. In that particular case, I would say that I probably, sort of showed some of my not so great leadership qualities and colors, but sometimes you also have to, in order to meet a deadline or in order to achieve a certain, goal, you have to sometimes be a dictator and not a. Sometimes it's a dictatorship and not a democracy.
And you've teched some pretty big shows. How do you get everything done in time? What's your style?
Well, I do an incredible amount of homework, and it's the kind of thing that sort of syncs up perfectly with my introverted nature, where I could meet with the designers or the creative team or the director, get a bunch of information, and then go home and sort it out myself. And that's indeed what I've done on Charlie, and it's really kind of been no different since I began being a production stage manager. I want to have as much information, sort of quote unquote, in the book as possible. And the tools that we have at our disposal these days, whether it's Word or Pages or Final Draft or whatever computer tools you have, in order to do that, make it a little bit easier for us to do that. And on Charlie, as you know, I had a lot of meetings over the summer and in the early fall with the design team as the design was being evolved. And so I understood it from, a very, I understood the genetics of it very early on. So as things were being changed or modified or adjusted, I could sort of understand where that came from. And by December, I had kind of put together a master cue sheet for the show, which I can probably, if we compared them side by side with how it exists today, I'd say probably 80% of it is what I created in my home office back in December. But again, we were lucky in this particular case that the creative team was all on the same page. We're also lucky that the story arc of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory really only moves in one direction. It really only can move one way. The design of the show only can really move one way. So we've all done shows where you can, move one number from Act 1 to Act 2, vice versa, shuffle things around. This show's not really like that. So that just makes it a little bit easier to sort of do that kind of homework and have it exist pretty much in the same form between the fall and now. But in terms of how I would manage a show that does have that kind of flexibility, the more, for me personally, that's on paper, in an Excel spreadsheet or in a Word document, when those movements start happening, it's easier, cut and paste, move here. It's easier for me to manipulate the documentation to match what is happening on stage when it's in that form from the very beginning. So on most of these big shows, I have a calling script that is set up from day one of rehearsal. So as changes are happening in the rehearsal room, I can start moving things around and changing them. It's what works for me, and as I've said again, I feel like I'm just repeating things I've said in class many times. But there's more than one way to skin a cat. So, but that's the way that I do it, and I encourage everyone to sort of steal those ideas from me or steal those ideas from other people, make your own, bring me ideas, because we're lucky enough to work in an industry in a particular segment of the industry where that kind of information methodology sharing is encouraged.
Speaking of encouraging words and thoughts from other people, what do you look for in assistants, and what do you look for when you're building a team?
Well, most of the time it's sort of an energy and personality complement or diversion, if you will, because I bring to the table certain skills that I feel I know. I don't. I want my other team members to bring the complements to those skills and do the things that I either don't have time for or would gladly spend weeks doing. I started in this business as an assistant, and I was an assistant stage manager for 15 years. And, it would be like just jumping into a warm bath for me to spend weeks doing prop lists and figuring out exactly what presets are going to be in terms of props and backstage and where does this go and how is this set. But I can't. As a production stage manager, I feel like I have to have my eye on a larger overall vision of the show. But it would be very easy for me to jump into those things. So I have to sort of actively stay out of that kind of in the trenches, granular detail. So I'm looking for assistants who are not only happy to do that, but are very good at it. I couldn't tell you now, or on any of the shows I've done in the last 5 years, where the props are set, what goes on backstage. And I'm not saying that, someone might listen to that and say, oh my God, how has he possibly gotten to this point in his career? But, I can't get involved in that unless I need to. I'm keeping, a creative team and a producing team, because so much of what we do as stage managers these days is directly related to very high level producers, and there we are in conversations with them, keeping all those, wheels turning and cogs going, and, not having a jam up in that part of the system is what I feel like I need to be spending my time on. So all of the other details I leave to my assistants. And also sometimes it's, who do you want to spend 18 hours a day with? So, but also people who understand and realize that it's people first and paperwork second, to be very to put it into a capsule.
And for the younger stage managers who are probably going to send you a resume to PA or intern, what are you looking for with the younger generation that's coming in?
Well, I look for a lot of different a variety of experiences, whether it's college, whether it's community theater, whether it's off Broadway, whether it's a regional tour or educational, whatever the case might be. I think that those of you who have collected up a lot of different, very disparate kind of experiences, I think are better off and better able to sort of manage some of these higher level, which is, for lack of a better term, productions here in New York with, high level creative teams and lots of different, pieces and parts moving at the same time. The other thing that I look for, that we've talked about many times, is the experiences that you have outside of the theater, whether for work or for pleasure, are, to me, sometimes more important than the experiences you've had inside, quote unquote, the business. Managing, a retail environment, managing an educational environment, working in the city park system. Those things have more to do with how we manage people than a lot of sometimes the isolated bubbles of the theatrical experience. So I always ask deeply, I delve deeply into that kind of experience and upbringing.
And you've said throughout this, in class, how did you get into teaching?
Well, again, I sort of just fell into it, but I've grown to love it. I loved it from the first time I started it. It's interesting. I did, for many, many years when I was a kid, I thought for sure I would be an elementary school teacher. And I was going to go to college for that, and then I got kind of involved in all the theater interests, and that sort of went by the wayside. But I often think that a lot of that initial impetus to become a teacher is exhibiting itself now. I started a number of years ago. Mary Hunter, who runs the program up at Yale, asked me to come up and do a couple of workshops, and that was great, and I loved it. And then when I was doing Evita back in 2012, I got a call from Steve Chakelson, who said who I had known casually through another friend of mine, for many years. And I knew he was up at Columbia, and he said, we're kind of revamping our stage manager program up here. Are you interested? And so we talked about it, and he told me kind of what the job was and how it was structured up there. And I was like, yeah, I guess. I said, I don't really know how to do any of that, but sure, I'll come up and talk to you guys about it. And I thought it was really just going to be a discussion, but I walked into a room where there was like a table of, like 8 or 9 people from the university and the School of the Arts and the dean and this, that, and the other thing. And I had sat in a chair in front of them, and it was pretty major. It was like very quote unquote academic. And then I was like, well, this isn't really for me. And then I had more conversations with Steve, and then I was brought back, and they offered me the job, and I said, but this is really just me kind of, telling stories and, fun things that I've done. And they're like, no, you have to create a curriculum, and you have to cultivate, a culture here and interest students. And I was like, okay. I said, I just want to raise my hand and say, I've never done that before. I have no idea what you're talking about, but if you want me to try this, I'm happy to try. So I literally called up all my friends on Broadway, and I said, hey, I'm doing this thing up at Columbia. You want to come up and help me out? And they're like, sure. So here we are. But no, I mean, seriously, it has focused me in a way and forced me to think about what we do as stage managers in a much more global context. And, as I've said before, it's not just standing in the dark anymore. It's not just us dressed in black behind curtains, whispering cues into a headset, these esoteric kind of, language that we speak. It's a, front and center job that is, ranks up there with any sort of executive position in any other major corporation, especially as Broadway has become this global brand, and things like Wicked, Jersey Boys, Hamilton, have become our sort of, Fortune 500 companies that are sent around the world. And again, no disrespect to any of the artistry of those shows, but, it's no different than, I think, buying, a McDonald's hamburger or Crest toothpaste, whether it's in this country, in China, in Japan, in England, or whatever. In fact, I think it's a compliment to what we do. But it's that kind of global interaction that we need to be setting ourselves up for. So when I thought about all of these things, when I was thinking about how to structure the program at Columbia, which, by the way, as you know, is always under under construction. I feel like that should be our sign, under construction, because it depends on the input of contemporary managers, of your colleagues, your student colleagues, and what you are seeing and hearing and feeling, out there in your experiences to bring back into the classroom and vice versa. And in fact, I think the program there is anything but sitting around and telling war stories. As you know, I try to avoid it at all costs, because having your experiences echo and be dissected, in the classroom and outside the classroom are more important than me telling stories about a number of people. So, but it's been great because, as I've said before, you guys keep me honest, and I, can sometimes, whenever I have you guys watching me, I'm on my best behavior, and I do better. Because I'm trying to sort of exhibit all the time the qualities that we talk about in the classroom. So I thrive on that. You make me a better stage manager. So it's a one hand helps and holds the other.
What's some advice you want to give to young people out there?
Young people?
Mm-hmm.
It's again what we talked about at the beginning, is that particularly for if you're a young stage manager, if you're in your high school or undergraduate, or even if you're in your graduate careers, take classes in business, psychology, history, art history, American history, world history, politics. Take classes and learn about those things because you're going to be a better stage manager. Read every section of the newspaper on your phone, or if you still hold it in your hand like many of my colleagues do. Read everything but the art section from cover to cover. Those things are going to make you better stage managers. They're going to make you better people, more rounded people, whether you're in this business or not. We talk about that a lot in class about some of the generalizations that are made about millennials, and I have found it not to be true at all. Not in the students that I've met, not in the people that we've met at Columbia. Be as well-rounded as you can be. Learn about things that you're not necessarily in that business of. That's my advice.
Something we also talk about in class is the idea of mentorship. Who are some mentors that you had? I know we talked about one. I forgot his name, but...
Well, Perry Klein, Peter von Meyerhauser, some of the colleagues that you know in the Columbia atmosphere. Bonnie Panson is a mentor of mine. I had I actually, now that you mention it, I had... my dear beloved mentor, Charlie Willard, who worked in this building many times. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't think of something that Charlie Willard told me when I knew him. And when I was an undergrad at NYU, in my senior year, there was a class called The Business of Theater, and he taught it, Charlie Willard. Charlie was a company manager for many, 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 many years in the late 60s and 70s and early 80s on Broadway. And he taught this class at NYU. He also went on to teach at Carnegie Mellon for many years. He taught a class called The Business of Theater, and I thought, sounds really boring. I'll learn to work in a box office or whatever. But literally the first thing out of his mouth was, in the first day of class, was, if you're coming to this class to learn how to run a box office, you should find your way to the exit, because the business of theater is so much more than just taking money over the, box office grill. And it was an incredible class, and he is the one who encouraged me to get my master's degree, and we had a great friendship. He, tragically passed away in the early 90s, and but there isn't, as I said, there's not a single day that goes by there's not something that reminds me of Charlie and reminds me of what he talked about, not only in his passion for the business, but in the way he thought about the business and the way he positioned himself to deal with the incredible pressures, the highs and the lows, the temperaments that we come in contact with every day. And he had a unique way of thinking about how managers fit into this business, and it's something that I hope to pass along to my students at Columbia.
Is there anything else that we have not talked about that you want to say?
Well, I'm sure there is, but I can't think of it now, because this has been a really great hour or so that we've been talking here. And it's an interesting thing, because I think that I think there's more to this project than we even know. Mm-hmm. That you've created here, and particularly for those who are your colleagues and your contemporaries now, not only to listen to some of us who are in the current generation of Broadway stage managers, the previous generation. I know you've also interviewed some folks who have made their careers and very fulfilling careers, in the regional theater. But you all should talk to one another, each other, and do this project, and then in 10 years, 15 years, come back and do it again. Let's see where you are.
Mm-hmm. And see how it's changed.
It'd be a good thing to do.
Yeah. All right. Thank you,
Anyway.
Michael.
Thanks, Rachel.